Russia is fighting the war in Ukraine with its fingers, not with its fists. What we're seeing on the ground is concocted, and it's fiction that is intended to deceive us. If Russia wanted to defeat the NATO alliance, it could do a nuclear EMP attack on NATO, and the resulting EMP field would black out electric grids from Ireland all the way to the edge of Ukraine. NATO would in effect be paralyzed by that one blow. Would the United States put itself at risk to save NATO Europe? Do the Russians really believe that we would do that? The Russians know that you can certainly win a nuclear war, and I think they're calling our bluff right now.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel we have a very special guest, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. He is Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, served as Chief of Staff of the Congressional EMP Commission. I've spoken about him and his work on this channel many times before, worked for the CIA and a variety of other places, I'm sure has a couple PhDs. And he's going to talk all about nuclear vulnerabilities on the NATO side of things, how a nuclear exchange between NATO and Russia might play out, maybe give some insights, whatever he can, on the current situation that's going on.
The idea that a nuclear war is unwinnable is deeply embedded in our strategic culture and in the values of Judeo-Christian civilization, which believe in just war theory, not limiting collateral damage, to civilian populations, and because free societies that are based on democracies or republics, the most valuable thing in them, at least theoretically, is supposed to be the people. And so weapons of mass destruction that threaten the people, it's almost inconceivable for such societies that place the highest value on human life as the idea that a nuclear war or use of weapons of mass destruction type war would be winnable. And as a consequence of our belief that a nuclear war is unwinnable, because it would be such a destructive thing, we have postured our strategic forces. People think that the Russian nuclear posture and our nuclear posture are the same. They're not. They're as different as night and day. It's true that both sides have intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarines and strategic bombers, but that's about where the similarity ends. Our strategic posture is positioned for transparency and for avoiding nuclear war and deterring it. So most of our weapons are not on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, which can be launched in minutes. We've even downloaded the warheads off of our ICBMs, so every ICBM only carries a single warhead. This is a signal to Russia that we don't plan a first strike against them. Because if you were planning a first strike, you'd build up your ICBM force, you'd put multiple warheads on it so that one missile could take out many silos, many targets. But we don't do that. In fact, the ICBM force is the smallest part of our triad. We rely much more heavily on sub-launched ballistic missiles that are not equipped with intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have intermediate range missiles. So our submarines have to put to sea in order to attack Russia. And they can see when our submarines are in port. We don't keep most of them at sea. Only about a third of them are out at sea to be survivable. The most of them are at port, and our adversaries can see that. So they can see we haven't mobilized our forces to launch a surprise attack against them. And the bombers, we have more warheads on them than we have on the ICBMs too, and it takes 3 days to mobilize our bomber force. So it's something that they would see us doing. We're not postured to make a surprise attack every day. The Russians are different. They have never forgotten the many surprise attacks that they've suffered, including Operation Barbarossa, which was when Nazi Germany almost conquered the Soviet Union and almost destroyed it in a massive surprise attack. And their general staff says, we're never going to be surprised again. If there's ever another war, we're going to be the ones making the surprise attack. And they have postured their strategic forces to do that exactly. Most of their warheads are on intercontinental ballistic missiles that are ready to launch in a few minutes. Even their ballistic missile submarines carry intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they don't have to put to sea in order to attack us. They can launch right from port side and strike us, just like the land-based ICBM force. Even their ballistic missile submarines at sea, unlike us, they usually don't send their submarines into the deep oceanic areas of the Pacific and the Atlantic. they're afraid that we would use our attack submarines to surprise them and attack their ballistic missile submarines. So they protect their submarines from surprise attack by keeping them in bastion areas, this White Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, which are heavily defended by their Navy. Now, underwater, they have cables across the bottom of these seas so that their submarines can clandestinely hook in to the General Staff Command and Control Network. So we can't even listen in if they're sending communications, unlocking codes, emergency action messages. They can get all of that secretly by these cables, just like all the other missile forces of Russia. They can raise the mobilization of their forces secretly. We won't see it, and then they could launch their surprise attack. The only part of the Russian strategic forces that's highly visible for us is their bomber force. The bombers, just because of the nature of bombers, they've got to be fueled up. They have to have pilots. You've got to upload the nuclear weapons. That's a very highly visible thing. But they have practiced and have exercised not mobilizing the bomber force so that we would see, oh, the bomber force isn't mobilized. That's a clue that they're not getting ready for a surprise attack. And they would hope that we would misinterpret, the non-mobilization of bombers so that we would not raise our posture. And in effect, that's exactly where we are today. This so far has sounded like a theoretical discussion, but a couple of Sundays ago, on February 27th, the dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared a special combat alert for his strategic nuclear forces. And he went down into one of the hundreds of deep underground command and control shelters. These are huge underground facilities buried under hundreds of meters of solid granite that can accommodate, each one of them can accommodate like 30,000 Russian military and political elites. They're impervious to nuclear attack by us. It's one of the evidences that they believe you can fight and win a nuclear war, because their elites at least can survive it. But they also have massive civil defense capabilities for their civilian population too. For example, all the subways, the huge subway system in Moscow has nuclear blast doors on it. None of our subways have something like that, so that you can get the population of Moscow down into the subways, close the doors, and they would have a much better chance of surviving a nuclear attack than we would if something like that were to happen. But the last thing any adversary, whether it's the Russians or the United States, is going to attack is the cities anyway. Because the objective of a nuclear war, if you want to win it, is to disarm your adversary, to destroy his bombers, his ICBMs, his submarines in port. That's what their first strike plan would be about. And then you can hold the cities hostage and say, surrender now, or we're going to start taking out your cities one by one. That's been the Russian plan. They have never agreed with the idea of mutual assured destruction. They have encouraged us to believe in mutual assured destruction so that we will not copy their plan, a war-winning plan. They want us to just focus on nuclear deterrence. And let us hope that it is not too late, okay? Because the Biden administration has been unwilling to admit that Russia has really gone to an increased readiness level with its nuclear forces. And I think that's being done for political reasons. They don't want to compound their humiliation in Afghanistan with an even worse humiliation and have to explain to the American people, why has Ukraine policy, what's so important about Ukraine to the West that we are willing to go to the verge of a nuclear war with Russia about it? And I'm not just blaming Biden here. The chicken hawks in the Republican Party are all for jumping into Ukraine and getting us involved in a war in Ukraine. And that's because they're being encouraged, by almost all of our information about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is coming from the Ukrainian government, which wants us to jump in and get involved in the war and help the Ukrainians win. And it's also coming from the Biden administration, because the Biden administration President Biden doesn't want the conversation to be about his throwing away of 50 years of American credibility. Our security guarantees to our allies are all based on our credibility, and that credibility is a precious thing. But he put it all on the line in Ukraine by drawing a line in the sand and saying, Russia, don't cross that line. And Putin went across that line with tanks. Biden and his people in the White House don't want the conversation to be about that. So they have an interest too in convincing us, well, he crossed the line, but the Russians aren't winning. They're doing very badly in Ukraine. They're bogged down. They're losing the war. But this encourages people to want to involve us in the war, to jump into the war. And I think that would be a grave mistake, because I don't think we can trust what we're being told. about the status of the war. The fog of war is very thick, especially when all of the intelligence is coming from two biased sources, the Ukrainian government and the Biden White House. The last thing they want to admit is that the Russians are getting what they want in Ukraine. We are probably making a very serious error in assuming that the Russians are losing. It could be that what we're hearing every night on television is true. Maybe that's true, but I would remind you that it was less than a year ago that in Afghanistan, we thought it was true that we could withdraw from Afghanistan and have an Afghan government that was sympathetic to the West and that they would not immediately fall, and that we basically wouldn't have to withdraw in a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Taliban. Our Department of Defense and our Joint Chiefs, led by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this was our most important thing. The credibility of the Biden administration depended upon it, but they couldn't even defeat the Taliban. In the end, we did suffer a humiliating defeat by them. We should be mindful before we get involved in a war over Ukraine to remember that our nuclear deterrent is not modern the way Russia's is, that it's 30 years old. All the delivery systems were built under the Reagan administration. The nuclear weapons themselves are more than 30 years old. They've not been tested in 30 years. We've been patching them up and hoping that they'll work. A lot of our own nuclear weapons scientists who designed those weapons have been warning that you can't monkey around with a nuclear weapon design like that and have high confidence that it's going to work. Not only has Russia got modern delivery systems and modern nuclear weapons, it has super weapons that have no counterpart in the US nuclear arsenal. Weapons designed to make what are called super EMP attacks. This is an electromagnetic field that could theoretically win a nuclear war with a single blow by frying the electronics in our forces as well as in our civilian society, the electric grids. Weapons that just generate X-rays so that their anti-missile systems will work. And by the way, that's another sign of the Russian belief that they can fight and win a nuclear war. They've got 10,000 anti-ballistic and anti-aircraft missiles, 10,000 of them, and they are dual capable. They can carry conventional or nuclear weapons. We have fewer than 100 anti-missile systems in our national missile defense, and they're not even capable of, we have grave questions about how effective they would be against the North Korean missile threat, because the North Korean missiles are based on Chinese and Russian technology, which is a lot more advanced than what we thought the North Koreans would end up with. The Russians also have a unilateral advantage in biological and chemical weapons because they've cheated on both of those treaties, just as they've cheated on the Tactical Nuclear Weapons Treaty, the Presidential Nuclear Initiative, and they have at least a 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons. I'm going to propose to you, and I'm not saying this is the ground truth in Ukraine, but I'm going to propose to you an alternative reality, something you're not going to hear from anybody else, I'm pretty sure, that is not, there's a different way of interpreting the facts on the ground in Ukraine. And it's the Austerlitz scenario. We're all convinced, and guys like Senator Graham want us to jump in and get involved in the war because the Ukrainians are telling us that they're killing Russians at the rate of 10-to-1. And the Russians, are on the verge of defeat. And if we only come in and help them, that we can quickly defeat the Russians. That's what everybody thinks with 100% certainty is the truth on the ground. And I say the fog of war is so thick and the circumstances such that we can't trust that. Maybe it's true, but I don't know it's true. This could be an alternative. Maybe this is all being done deliberately by the Russians, and they want us to think that they're bogged down, and they want us to think that they're losing the battle, because they want us to jump into the Ukrainian war and crush us with that 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons, the advantage in biological and chemical weapons, their advantage in cyber weapons, and just crush us and permanently solve the problem of NATO and the United States. It might be more about taking over Ukraine. It might be more than taking over Ukraine in terms of the Russian objective. Maybe what they want to do is just change the world order by becoming the top dog in that world order. And how is the Battle of Austerlitz relevant to this? Well, the Russian general staff are great students of military history. Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest victory in 1805. And they make particular study of that one because the victory was over Russia itself. The combined armies, the greatest powers of Europe, of the mainland Europe were involved in that battle. Russia, Austria, and Prussia were all allied together on one side against Napoleon, against the French army. And Napoleon, where it was fought, it was closer to Russia. So Napoleon wanted to create the impression that he was going to lose this battle. He sent intelligence to the Russians and Austrians that he was overextended, that he had supply problems, that he didn't have enough men. He deliberately occupied the worst part of the battlefield. He had troops defect to the Russians and Austrians to tell them, we're beaten. We're not going to lose this war. He actually had whole regiments of French troops retreat from the Russians. All of this was to lure them into attacking and have battle there on what had been Napoleon's chosen ground, so that he could then unleash a number of corps that he could see concealed from view, and he crushed the combined forces of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and it gave Napoleon dominance over Europe for the next decade. So these crowned heads of Europe, while he didn't take over their countries, they were basically bootlickers to Napoleon and had to do whatever he said until Napoleon made the fatal decision to invade Russia and stayed too long. But it could be, I submit, and I'm not saying that this is the scenario that's happening. It could be that Russians are bogged down and they're losing. But I think we have to be more imaginative and think about, well, what are other scenarios that may be possible? Is it possible that they actually want us to intervene? It's hard to resist the conclusion that a lot of the things the Russians are doing are deliberately intended to provoke us. There are a few things that are harder for the Western democracies to resist than intervening against a cruel dictator, an inhuman dictator who seems to be militarily weak, and so it will be easy to defeat him. And that seems to be an impression that Putin, maybe it's true that he is that, but it's certainly an impression he's doing nothing to discourage and by his day-to-day behavior. There's another scenario about Ukraine that we ought to keep in mind. Everybody has assumed going into this, and I have to admit, even myself, that if the Russians invaded Ukraine, they would want a quick victory. Because here I forgot about my own lesson about mirror imaging, that we ought not to assume that our enemies think the way we do and would wage war the way the West would. We always want a quick victory. We want the killing and the battles to be over as soon as possible, and to capture the territory as soon as possible. And we had a reason to think that Russia might do that in Ukraine because of the way they took over Crimea. They did it in lightning speed, very little bloodshed, and it was a great victory for them. But there was another scenario going on right under our noses that we appear to have ignored. And that's what's happened to Luhansk and the battle, the long siege war that's been going on in eastern Ukraine. That's been going on for 8 years. The Russians at any time could have ended that war. They could have decisively taken over that area, but they haven't. They deliberately wanted to have a protracted war in that area. Maybe what Putin wants is to permanently have a long war going on in Ukraine as long as he can do it. Something we need to remember is that chaos is in the national interests of Russia. It dries up oil prices. Their second most important industry is armaments. When the world thinks it's always on the verge of World War III, people are much more interested in buying arms. And so that's going to help the Russian arms industry. Here's another scenario. And several of these scenarios, by the way, can be simultaneously true. Another scenario is the Spanish Civil War. Before Nazi Germany launched World War II, they wanted to make sure that their new weapons and tactics, the blitzkrieg that enabled them to almost win World War II, they wanted to make sure it would work. And they wanted to have veteran soldiers who had combat experience. And so they used the Spanish Civil War to give combat experience to many of their soldiers and to test out their new weapons and tactics. I think it's no accident that Russia is using some of its advanced weapons, like the hypersonic Iskander has been launched. I'm pretty sure that they didn't do that just to destroy a building. I think the reason they're doing that is to test out their new weapon systems, to give experience to their troops in launching these systems, to give experience to their ground troops and to their general staffs. And well, here's how you actually fight a real war. A veteran soldier who's got combat experience, who's been blooded, is worth 2 or 3 soldiers who are green and who have never been exposed to combat. And I think that that's one of the things Putin wants out of this war, whether he's losing or not. He's going to value very highly the experience that his general staff and that his ground troops have gotten out of Ukraine. So these are all alternative theories to the one that is the only one that we're hearing on television every day. The one that has the happy face on it for us is that, oh, the Russians are on the verge of defeat and we can jump in there and help the Ukrainians achieve a quick victory. Please be aware. There are at least several alternative theories that suggest that if we do that, we're going to be handed another Afghanistan, another Iraq, another Syria, another Libya, another military disaster, except this one won't be a small one. This one would be, it could destroy NATO and it could destroy the United States and it could change the balance of power in the world if we're wrong about this assessment that we're hearing every day on television.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that theory because I've heard that, and I don't know if this is true, like you say, the fog of war, but that a lot of the newer weapon systems aren't actually being used in Ukraine yet, like the newer jets, like the I think it's the Su-35, or is it the 42, one of their most advanced fighter jets. A lot of their Air Force hasn't been deployed. They're only, as of recent, using hypersonic weapons. And it does appear like a lot of that is, like you say, a potential testing ground for these things. So your first theory that you propose of them trying to bait NATO into a fight and appearing weak when they're in fact strong would make a lot of sense, in light of that, because we're not seeing a lot of their more advanced weaponry that they could bring to bear being used. At least we're not seeing it.
Sure. And to expand upon the points that you and I have both made, the Russia only mobilized 200,000 troops to invade Ukraine. They have an army, a standing army of 1 million men. Only 75% of that 200,000 has actually gone into Ukraine. They have 2,000 aircraft in their Air Force, and they haven't unleashed the Air Force really. Ukraine has got 70 modern aircraft. All these air victories that they're achieving are with 70 aircraft. The Armata, their new Armata tank hasn't been sent in. Their older model tanks they've sent in to fight you. They've got 20,000 tanks, by the way. And only Russia is fighting the war in Ukraine with its fingers, not with its fists. It has vast conventional military potential that has not been unleashed in Ukraine. And on these things too make me suspicious that what we're seeing on the ground is concocted, and it's a fiction that is intended to deceive us and maybe lure us into the war. I could be wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope the Ukrainians are really doing as well as they're telling us they're doing. But even if they are, Russia is a nuclear superpower. And if we were to intervene, it's a virtual certainty it would escalate, and we would be the losers in that. They're postured to win a nuclear war right now, and we're very close to the edge right now, I think. The possibilities of miscalculation are extremely, even more worrisome to me than what Russian designs may be. But we were concerned about a scenario that could happen now over the crisis in Ukraine. That if Russia wanted to defeat the NATO alliance, it could do a nuclear EMP attack on NATO by detonating a nuclear weapon, a super EMP weapon, at high altitude, 70 kilometers high, that's outside the atmosphere, over NATO headquarters in Brussels. And the resulting EMP field would black out electric grids from Ireland, United Kingdom, France, all the way to the edge of Ukraine. The whole NATO alliance would be blacked out. And when you've blacked out the electric grids, all the other critical infrastructures fail too. There'd be no water, food would start spoiling, no telecommunications, transportation systems wouldn't work. None of the things would work that you need to mobilize your forces to defend yourselves. NATO would in effect be paralyzed by that one blow. It would be a red carpet for those 20,000 Russian tanks to reach the English Channel virtually unopposed. So that's how a nuclear EMP works, or in terms of the strategic application of a nuclear EMP attack. How does it work in terms of the physics? An EMP attack, an EMP is like a super energetic radio wave, and it's got so much energy in it that it'll fry electronics, so the electronics will be destroyed across the area that the EMP field is exposing. And in this case that I just described, the EMP field would reach from eastern Poland all the way to Ireland with an EMP attack like that. You could do an EMP attack over North America that would do the same thing. at an altitude of 300 kilometers, the field would cover most of Canada, all 48 contiguous United States, and a good chunk of Mexico. And not only would our civilian unprotected systems be destroyed by the super EMP, but our military systems as well, because they're not hardened that high. During the Cold War, we only hardened them to 50,000 volts per meter, which is a very high level. I mean, imagine that, 50,000 volts per meter, but a super EMP weapon can make 100,000 or 200,000 volts per meter. Imagine if you had most of the things in our electronic society operate on 120 volts or less. Imagine if you had a plug in your house that could generate 100,000 volts. I mean, what do you think would happen if you plugged anything into that outlet? Obviously, it would be destroyed. And so, in effect, that's what you're doing when you put an EMP field down over a whole continent. Everything that's got electronics. Now, not everything would be destroyed necessarily. A lot of things, even most things, might survive, but so much would be destroyed that it would all come grinding to a halt. It doesn't take much to stop an electronic civilization and to kill it. It's like the body. You don't have to destroy every organ in the body to kill a person. If you destroy enough, a few percentage, but much stuff would be destroyed, probably be much more than a few percentage than by a super EMP weapon. So automobiles stop, airplanes fall out of the sky, that sort of thing.
So don't you think, though, that if they were to deploy such a weapon, and I guess this is where I'd like to get more insight about the non-nuclear EMP weapons, because don't you think if they were to deploy such a thing, that would basically bring the full force of NATO into the war, like with the US in terms of their nuclear arsenal? Like, wouldn't that prompt a nuclear response from the US?
Well, our nuclear weapons have to work. Even the nuclear weapons, the electronics in the delivery systems, the bombers, the ICBMs, the ballistic missile submarines, these are vastly complicated electronic machines. And they're only hardened to 50,000 volts per meter. Their electronics are going to be vulnerable too. And we might not even know who attacked us. The first thing that gets taken out by an EMP are the satellites and the ballistic missile early warning radars. The EMP travels at the speed of light. In order for us to know who attacked us, those things have to survive. And then you have to have the retaliatory capability. The whole point of doing an EMP would be to deny your adversary his retaliatory capability by destroying it.
And I had Dr. Arthur Bradley on here, and we talked about your paper that you had written about the potential use for an EMP weapon in Europe. And he said that one of the things that he wasn't quite in agreement with was he thought that would immediately prompt a nuclear response in the United States. So you don't think so? Like, obviously on continental Europe, those systems might be fried, potentially the ones that aren't hardened. But what about, like, what would the US response to that be? Like, would they start launching nukes at Moscow, or would there be like some deniability there? Like, because I think he even said that they would be able to see right when the nuke went up into space. Is that true? Or
well, the United States would be able to see when the single missile went up into space. Maybe not.
Either them or their command and control in Europe would be able to see that if they launched this EMP weapon, like right when they launched it, that we would detect it.
Europe doesn't have the large phased array ballistic missile early warning radars that we do, and they're not aimed over the continent of Europe. What we might pick up if they decided to do it with an intermediate range ballistic missile. We might pick up the launch of that single missile, but a lot of missiles are being launched from Russia. And how would we know that missile isn't intended to armed with a conventional warhead? Or even if it's armed with a nuclear warhead, how do we know it's not going to go to the ground to attack an airbase or something like that? Our satellites and the North American air defense array is oriented for missiles coming over the North Pole to attack the United States, not chiefly Europe. And you can do it clandestinely. You could launch a satellite and say this is a space launch vehicle. And in fact, the Russians had a secret weapon called the fractional orbital bombardment system. China has it too now. They basically experimented with this. You could pretend that you're launching a space satellite for peaceful communications purposes, but you've got a super EMP warhead inside it. North Korea's got 2 satellites orbiting over North Korea as we speak, the KMS-3 and KMS-4. That they declared are peaceful satellites, but the EMP Commission has warned that these things could be armed with super EMP warheads, and they might be orbiting us so that in an emergency, North Korea could detonate them, when they need to do an EMP attack. There's all kinds of ways of you could launch the EMP out of a attack submarine, a cruise missile that goes to high altitude. They've got such missiles. One of them they market internationally. It's called the Club K, and it flies at subsonic speeds for a long period of time, close to the water. But then at the last minute, it can go up to high altitude, high enough to do an EMP attack at supersonic speeds. So they have many platforms, many different ways of doing it that don't involve ICBMs, that would be detectable by radar, ballistic missiles by us. And that is the question that your friend has said, and that is the usual answer. That's what a lot of people have an inherent faith in is, well, surely if Russia made a nuclear attack on European NATO, the United States is going to respond, and that's what's going to deter it. That has been the whole basis of the belief of mutual assured destruction. That's what we've been gambling on. What we're doing here in Ukraine isn't building up our credibility, that we're willing to take existential risks in order to save our friends.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point that I don't think a lot of, and it goes back to that fundamental belief about mutually assured destruction, is we take for granted this notion that, we're suddenly going to jump in, and just because Russia uses a nuke over there, that we're suddenly going to jump in and be the saviors and put our own existence at risk. But, perhaps our military generals, aren't going to play that game, and maybe Russia knows it, and they're going to call the bluff, as you say.
Exactly. I think they're calling the bluff now. And that's why they invaded Ukraine, because they don't believe it anymore. They don't believe that we are credible when it comes to our nuclear security guarantees. Why should they? When we have allowed our nuclear triad to become obsolete, and when we have nuclear weapons that have been untested in 30 years. Congress accepts every year, the national laboratories every year, they get certified. The nuclear weapons still work, even though we haven't tested them, and even though we're patching them together. But do the Russians and Chinese believe that? They've been testing their nuclear weapons. The State Department admitted last year that they've been violating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for 30 years, and they've been doing low-yield tests of their nuclear weapons, so they can have confidence their nuclear inventory is going to work. Everything out of our mouths and everything we do would lead our adversaries to think that we don't take nuclear deterrence seriously anymore. And I think they're calling our bluff right now. I'm almost reluctant to say this because this is a Canadian audience, all right?
But we're mostly actually an American audience, believe it or not.
Okay, but as an advocate of national interest, of America first and a national interest, if I were advising a president and Russia started a nuclear war in NATO, I'd say, I don't think I would advise the president to put America at risk to save the NATO member states who have basically not done their job to maintain their militaries at a sufficient level of strength to deter the Russians. That's been a long complaint from us. I mean, they have allowed their military strength to so deteriorate that they've become tempting. I mean, I think one of the other reasons Russia has been willing to invade Ukraine is that they know NATO is militarily hollow. I mean, do you know that, there was a time during the Cold War when Germany, had a couple of thousand main battle tanks. Germany has 250 main battle tanks today. But we had 5,000 main battle tanks in Germany during the Cold War. Obama took them all out. There were 0 main battle tanks, US main battle tanks in Europe under Obama. Trump started putting some back in, but we only have 100 main battle tanks in Germany today. One of the reasons the Ukrainians are doing so well is the Ukraine has as many main battle tanks as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the Benelux countries combined. That's one of the reasons they may be doing so well against the Russians, because they've got many more main battle tanks than European NATO has. The other part of the equation, going back to the scenarios, if Ukraine is achieving victory over the Russians, and that happens to be true, does that, even if it's true, does that mean it should jump into it? Let's not forget, by the Russians fighting the Ukrainian army, they're in effect fighting the Russian army. The Ukrainian general staff and their troops were trained by the Russians. They're using Russian military equipment. The Ukrainians know how the Russian general staff thinks. That may be another reason why, if they're doing well, they're doing well. Why would we assume that we would find the same fortune, assuming the Ukrainians are meeting with good fortune? We haven't tested our stuff against Russian plans, Russian equipment, the Russian way of warfare. We might be very surprised to discover that our hollowed out militaries in European NATO don't do well on the Ukrainian battlefield. We can't even do it, by the way. NATO has never exercised projecting large numbers of general purpose forces into Eastern Europe. The defense of Western European NATO at the height of the Cold War was always defensive. The Russians were supposed to attack, and we were supposed to hold them off. And we thought we would have to resort to tactical nuclear weapons in order to hold them off. This idea that we're going to project power into Eastern Europe and defeat the Russians sounds very Napoleonic to me. I don't mean 1805 Napoleonic. I mean 1812 Napoleonic, when he led the French army, the Grand Army, into Russia, and it ended up getting destroyed by General Winter and by the Russian army. But to go back to your friend, I mean, it all depends on credibility. He speaks with such great certainty that yes, the United States would do that. I don't know that that's clear at all. We hope, or at least our European allies hope, the United States would do that. Japan hopes that we will come to their rescue. Our other partners in the Pacific hopes that we would use our nuclear weapons to defend them, to deter the nuclear umbrella. But the nuclear umbrella is old and tattered and tired, and even and at least this current political leadership seems to believe in it so little that that in Geneva last summer he said a nuclear war cannot be won, and should never be fought, forgetting that the United States has won a nuclear war. We won World War II. That was a nuclear war. The Russians know that you can certainly win a nuclear war against any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, and that's most of the world. But we seem to have forgotten that lesson. The assumption that a nuclear war can't be won is based all on this hope, or this premise, that the United States will be there for our allies and be willing to put our own homeland at risk, even if they attack Latvia, with a nuclear weapon. Most Americans can't even find Latvia on a map. Someone once said, never promise to go to nuclear war for a country you can't find on a map. We could have a whole other conversation about whether we should have expanded NATO in the first place. I don't think we should have, because it created this very situation. When I was a young man, I was on the House Armed Services Committee, and I had the NATO portfolio. And one of my jobs was to go to these East European countries that were former Warsaw Pact countries and come back and advise Congress on whether we should expand NATO to the East or not. And I said we shouldn't. These countries are really not capable of defending themselves. Their economies are weak. They're going to be dependent. We can't defend them. We can't project power. The only way we can defend them is with our nuclear deterrent. So we are going to basically be giving a promissory note to countries like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, all these former Warsaw Pact member states, a promissory note that we're going to go to nuclear war to defend their sovereignty. As a footnote to the Ukraine war, by the way, one of the main reasons Russia has invaded Ukraine is because it believed that Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO. And that even if we didn't officially make Ukraine a member of NATO, that it had in effect was becoming a de facto member of NATO. Aren't we behaving exactly as if that's true? And isn't our behavior and this warmongering that's going on playing right in to the paranoid views of the Russian general staff and a lot of the Russian people that, look, Putin was right. We were planning to make Ukraine a member of NATO, and we're behaving just as if they're really a member of NATO. My heart bleeds for the Ukrainians, but the survival of our own nations come first.
is what do you think the likelihood is where we're at now with what's going on in Eastern Europe of an actual, like if you were to put it at like a percentage, of nuclear weapons being used, and I know it's totally arbitrary, but just to give our viewers a sense of, because we're all about preparedness here and trying to prepare for these events. And I live in Saskatchewan, which is right above the, North Dakota, Montana, that whole place where they got the ICBMs. So, a lot of people want to know, like, what is the real threat of this at this point in time?
We are certainly at an elevated risk. I think the danger of a nuclear conflict, both law, whether it starts and the escalatory possibilities, I think our situation today is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have never before put ourselves in a situation where the adversary has declared the mobilization of his forces and is postured for surprise attack while we just do nothing. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis raised the DEFCON level of our nuclear deterrent almost as high as he could without actually getting in a nuclear war. He actually went to DEFCON 2, which is just short of actually getting into nuclear war. And as a consequence, he was able to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis and prevail in that crisis. This is the first time we've ever faced, a real possibility of a surprise nuclear attack, but we've left our forces at DEFCON 5, and I think Biden has done that for political reasons because he doesn't want to admit that we're in a nuclear crisis, but it leaves our forces vulnerable. The submarines are not at sea. The bombers are not being mobilized. The ICBMs are at their normal everyday readiness. The crucial command and control assets, which are particularly the TACOM aircraft, all of them are at Tinker Air Force Base, almost all of them, except for two. On a normal situation, we keep one on the Atlantic coast and one on the Pacific coast. But almost all of them are just sitting ducks, sitting there at Tinker. They should have been dispersed, but they haven't been. So the opportunity for our adversary is very good if he wanted to do it now. And the geostrategic situation that we are facing right now, for years and years, everyone has agreed, that a scenario that is most likely to result in a nuclear war is exactly the one we're looking at now, where the two superpowers became engaged in a big war in Europe. And that's what's happened. That's your most important indicator. So I think I can't put a percentage on it, but even a small increase in the possibility of an existential threat should be unacceptable to us, because the consequences are doom, and I think there's been at least an increase by a small percentage. I think it's much bigger than that. I think we're very close to the edge. And let's hope that the critics are not right, that Putin has gone crazy, that he's facing an internal revolt by his own elites. People are sort of celebrating that and cheering that on. I can't think of an even more dangerous situation than a major war in Europe where the two superpowers are involved and one side is crazy. I mean, that's not, you can't put a happy face on that scenario when it comes to the prospects of nuclear war.
Yeah. And I just want to conclude in saying that, I've had a lot of people comment on the channel about how, well, we have secret weapons and, this exceptionalist view that I think for a lot of people is an idea they hold on to comfort themselves, that we, we might not be sharing our plans, but, we have a plan, don't worry, but to me, that's a very convenient thing for us to believe. But, what if
denial behavior? Psychiatrists call it denial behavior. People who don't want to face up to reality. We're a very open society. It's very hard for us to keep secrets. I wish it were true, that we had secret weapons that were stored away, and all of this, and our vulnerability is not a fact. I had described Russian strategic culture as one of dysfunctional, of paranoia. Okay, our strategic culture I describe as dysfunctional optimism. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you get from our strategic culture. We don't want to face up to the hard, scary facts. We would prefer to see the bright side. If there's any way of seeing a bright side, we look at that side. Oh, the Russians are being beaten in Ukraine. They're winning. That's got to be the reality. It can't be that there's some other alternative theory that isn't as positive for our side. And if there isn't a positive reality for us or a positive possibility for us to look to, then we invent things. We'll actually invent scenarios that don't even exist, like, oh, well, we've got a secret weapon that's going to change everything. And so we don't have to worry about that. I can go back to living the good life and having a good time and sleep well at night, and this has gotten us into trouble in all of our wars too. Every one of these defeats that we've had since the end of World War II, including the beginning of World War II itself, has come out of a strategic culture of dysfunctional optimism, where we think, if all conflicts can be negotiated away, and if they can't be negotiated away, then we can get in there and our military primacy is always going to win, and we can reconstruct the victim society, the other side, share along our own image and to share our values. And I don't know how many times we have to lose a war, to learn the lesson. We never seem to learn, and maybe it's impossible for us to learn. Maybe it's our hubris, because it's the nature of our strategic culture, which is rooted in this. But that's why we have specialists and experts who are supposed to worry about these things for us. Alas, we don't listen to them. There have been people telling us and warning us. The bomb designers, the missile designers, the Department of Defense has been warning for many years. The deterrent is getting old. It's almost at the point where it has no credibility at all anymore, and people have been ignoring them. In fact, the administration, the dysfunctional optimism is to the point of fantasy now. Because the anti-nuclear activists who are not a fringe group anymore, they are in the Biden administration. The Biden administration, an important part of their political base, are anti-nuclear activists. There are important positions in the Biden administration that anti-nuclear activists have been appointed to. There are leading members of Congress in very important positions, like Adam Smith, who's in effect an anti-nuclear activist. He's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. After President Biden, he's the second most important man in America to decide whether we're going to modernize our nuclear deterrent and our conventional forces, because he controls the defense budget. And Adam Smith has been for banning our ICBMs, getting rid of our strategic bombers, and cutting the ballistic missile submarine fleet in half, because he believes in minimum deterrence and mutual assured destruction. And nuclear weapons are unusable, and you can't win a nuclear war. So all we need is the bare minimum, and we'll be okay. And these people haven't given up on that. Even in the situation that we're going through now, the Biden administration has been holding off on the nuclear posture review, which could make all of this come true. All of these bad things could come true on Biden's nuclear posture review. They haven't changed their minds, despite the fact of this being on the edge of a nuclear conflict with Russia over Ukraine. So this is another example of denial behavior and what a strategic culture of dysfunctional optimists will do.
Yeah, I agree. And it would appear to me that if you had something like that, you would want to put it out there that you had it as a deterrence, because that would be in line with our deterrence strategy thus far.
Yeah, what's the point of it if you don't have it? Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, anyways, it's been great having you on today, and I appreciate you coming on, sharing your expertise. I hope that you would come back and join us again. I'm going to, we're going to put this out there for the community. And if they have questions, we will compile some more questions for you. And as this whole thing progresses, I'm sure, your insights are bound to change and evolve as well. So thanks a lot for coming out.